On October the 17th, 1888, Kane Fisher heard Mr. Lyle at the feed store read the dawn temperature aloud from his hanging thermometer. 24 degrees in Cedar Bluff, Wyoming territory. By noon, the sun still warmed wagon iron and drew the smell of dry sage from the hills east of town, and men at the hitching rail talked as if that proved winter would stay reasonable. The church register said 346 souls lived in Cedar Bluff, and Kane could have named most of them by sight. Most believed they understood winter because they had survived 2 hard seasons and 1 bad one. They measured danger by memory. What had happened to their own houses, their own barns, their own stock? At the eastern edge of town, where wind traveled low and unbroken across a narrow strip of stony ground, Kane measured danger another way, by fractions of inches and sealed lids, and how cold moved through wood when men forgot to account for air. She had become an orphan in the same summer she should have been learning social graces and hymn verses with girls her age. Typhoid came through Cedar Bluff in July, followed by August heat that baked manure and refuse into a dust no one could keep out of wells. And within 6 weeks, both of her parents were dead and buried on the slope behind the churchyard fence. Her father, Elias Fisher, had kept accounts for 3 ranches before settling as a small grower, and her mother, May Fisher, had preserved enough produce each year to feed 5 extra mouths through January if a storm or failed shipment cut the road. Neither had been wealthy. Both had been exacting. Their legacy was not land or gold, but method. After the burials, Pastor Samuel Dent turned over to Kane a wrapped packet that her mother had left with him in spring to be opened if sickness ever took them both. Inside lay one oilskin notebook, 48 pages copied in 2 different hands, and then in a third, older hand, so faded that some words required lamplight and patience. Elias had written measurements for floor joists, draft channels, and frost depth notes from 3 counties. May had written salt ratios, drying times, cellar temperatures, and a full page headed winter rules, with each line beginning in the same plain script. Raise the sleeper from the floor. Keep the wind moving where you choose. Keep the food where freezing cannot split it. At the back, in older writing, were notations from Kane's grandparents in Tennessee Hill Country, and from great-grandparents who had farmed rocky ground farther east, where spring floods and winter hardpan punished alike those who guessed. In September, when town women brought stew and folded blankets in gestures that were sincere yet brief, Kane thanked them, then sold the last 2 milk goats, kept 1 hand saw and 1 broad axe, and paid $11 cash for a narrow lot no one else wanted. The parcel sat beyond the better homes, where a wagon wheel sank in thaw and rattled over stone in freeze, and where no cottonwood stood to break the prevailing winter wind. Kane heard Harlan Beckett, proprietor of Beckett General Mercantile, telling customers at his porch rail that afternoon that the child had purchased a strip fit only for crows and nuisance weeds. She kept walking, but the words carried. He said it while checking his silver watch chain against his waistcoat and brushing trail dust from broadcloth sleeves imported by rail from Omaha. He was a large man gone soft with success, cheeks polished with cold cream in winter and barber oil in summer, his gloves always clean, his boots always new, and his ledgers thick with the names of men who owed him for seed, flour, and harness leather. Kane did not dispute him. She marked corners with survey twine, tested the ground with an iron bar, and laid out a rectangle 14 feet by 22, enough for 1 room and a crawl space that could hold food and heat alike if planned with care. She hired no crew because she could not afford one and because she trusted fewer hands than 1 in town when precision mattered. Stone piers came first, 12 fieldstone columns, each set below frost depth at 30 inches and raised to a uniform height so that finished floorboards would stand exactly 3 feet above grade. Lime mortar cost $1.70 per sack, She used 2 sacks and stretched them with screened ash and sand carried from the creek bed in feed bags. Salvaged pine beams from freight crates cost $4 for the lot after she traded 20 jars of pickled carrots and onions to a teamster whose wagon had broken an axle west of town. She cut and planed each beam until every joint seated square and tight. By the first week of October, children were already pausing at the lot fence to watch her work and carry home stories that grew less accurate each retelling. Kane heard versions of those stories when she passed people on Water Street. She was building a watchtower, a smokehouse, a scaffold for hanging laundry above wolves. She framed the floor in 2 layers, not one. The lower frame carried rough planks laid with a deliberate 6-inch gap above the finished floor, creating dead air that slowed conductive loss at night when surface cold was sharpest. Between stone piers, she stacked straw bales in alternating orientation, then sealed outer faces with clay wash and packed ash against the windward side to blunt underfloor gusts. Her mother had called that system a wind baffle, and Kane built it exactly as written. Straw for trapped air, ash for density, clay for sealing. No ornament, no wasted motion. When Beckett saw the raised frame from his delivery wagon, he laughed in full view of 6 men unloading flour barrels and called the structure Fisher Folly. Kane was carrying a plank at the time and heard every word. His voice was crisp and public. She is building a chicken coop for herself. By December, she will crawl down from that perch and ask for real lumber on credit. The line traveled through Cedar Bluff by supper. Men repeated it at the hitching rail. Women repeated it at wash lines where shirts froze stiff before noon. By Sunday, even boys too young to split kindling were saying Fisher Folly, as if it were a chant with a tune. Kane kept laying boards. The house rose plain and stubborn against open wind. 1 room with a steep roof pitch to shed load, a small west window for afternoon light, and shutters thick enough to bar drifting snow. She built the threshold high and stuffed the jam cavities with wool remnants bought by weight for 18 cents a pound. She framed a cook stove bench along the interior wall, lining it with fired clay and broken brick so it could hold radiant heat and release it gradually through night hours. She suspended her bed frame from stout uprights and kept the mattress well clear of floor level, following the first winter rule without compromise. Under the planked floor, accessed by a hatch with a gasketed lid, she prepared storage by temperature tier. Jars nearest center where readings stayed near 55 degrees, root sacks farther out, smoked meat highest and driest. She tested the crawl space with 2 glass thermometers, purchased at 35 cents each, and checked them morning and evening for 9 consecutive days. Food preservation began before walls were fully closed. Kane worked through afternoons and lamplit evenings, salting, drying, and sealing with the disciplined pace of someone who understood that winter punished delay more than poverty. She rendered lard and sealed it under parchment circles tied with twine. She packed beans in brine by measured weight, 1 pound salt to 6 gallons water for long hold, slightly stronger for barrels that might ride out hard freeze. She dried sliced turnip, carrot, and parsnip on racks hung above a low smoke, rotating trays every 4 hours so moisture left evenly. By October 29th, she had stacked 94-quart jars in straw-lined crates, hung 4 smoked hams from rafters under mesh against rodents, and filled 10 burlap sacks with dried root vegetables, each tagged by date and weight in pencil, copied from her father's ledger habit. Cedar Bluff still watched and judged, and Kane could feel it whenever she crossed town for nails or lamp oil, glances that lingered, talk that paused and resumed behind her shoulder. She kept measuring and storing. The balance between those 2 habits defined the season before anyone admitted what kind of winter was coming. When the first true cold tested the settlement, 1 house stood with its floor 3 feet above frozen ground and with heat held where sleeping feet could keep it. Kane had built that result board by board, dollar by dollar, rule by inherited rule, and she had done it while the town called her work folly. On November the 3rd, the sun rose into a sky so clear it seemed polished, and by mid-afternoon, Kane read 62 degrees on the shaded side of her own wall, a warmth that pulled men out to porches in shirt sleeves and convinced Cedar Bluff that the season had turned merciful. By supper, wagon wheels cut shallow ruts in thawed mud along Water Street, and Beckett stood outside his mercantile speaking loudly about late grazing and easy freight runs, as if confidence could bargain with January. Kane watched geese cross low and hard from the northwest in a tight arrow that did not break, and she watched frost gather at the base of her stone piers even before sunset. By dawn the next morning, the same thermometer that had flirted with summer stood at 9 degrees, and pump handles burned bare skin again. The shift was not weather wandering. It was a warning written in numbers. She read it with the discipline Elias Fisher had demanded when teaching her ledgers at the kitchen table, years earlier, where mistakes were corrected in ink and then explained in full. Her father had said that false warmth in late autumn could tempt a town into foolish spending and wasted motion, because souls spent mild days as if there would be more of them. May Fisher had taught the second half of that lesson while tying herbs in bundles above the stove, saying that true preparation required labor done when no one praised it and no one believed it was needed. Kane carried both teachings in method rather than speech. She checked her 2 crawlspace thermometers at first light and wrote the readings in the notebook margin, then stepped to the windward side of the house and listened under the floor for movement of air through the ash-packed baffles. She found none. The seal held. By November 5th, she had drafted a purchase list in blunt pencil: 12 pounds coarse salt, 2 extra lamp chimneys, 6 yards of wool scrap for draft plugs, 1 keg nail assortment, 2 gallons coal oil, and any cracked barrel staves Beckett would sell cheap for pallet bracing. She rode into town on her small bay mare, Juniper, with the list folded in her coat and a jar of preserved beets wrapped in cloth for trade. Men at the hitching rail nodded to one another and then away from her, not hostile in the open manner of a quarrel, but careful in the manner of debtors who did not wish to offend a creditor standing nearby. Beckett greeted 3 ranch hands by name before he acknowledged Kane at all. When he did, he held out the oil ledger and tapped the new figure with 1 polished fingernail. 45 cents a gallon, he said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Demand has gone brisk, and supply runs uncertain. You may hide beneath that raised floor of yours if winter delays itself. She set her beet jar on the counter and did not move her hand from it. Your posted rate was 22 cents last week. Last week is done, he replied. You are free to buy or decline. Credit remains closed. She paid for 1 gallon only, took no salt, and left with her list still half unmet. 3 days passed before the second warning arrived. A freight train west of Medicine Bow jumped track in high crosswind and shattered 2 supply cars, 1 carrying kerosene and 1 carrying bagged flour, and telegraph word reached Cedar Bluff by evening that regular wagon replenishment would be delayed no less than 4 weeks, perhaps 6 if weather cut the pass. The town heard that report and treated it as inconvenience rather than threat. Beckett told customers he had enough stock in reserve and advised calm purchasing at his revised prices. Kane stood outside the church after Sunday service, nailed a plain board to the notice post, and wrote in square charcoal letters large enough to read from the gate: Severe winter likely. Preserve now. Raise sleeping platforms. Seal drafts by Sunday. Follow rope routes in whiteout. Pastor Samuel Dent read the notice twice, then looked down the road toward the Fisher lot with a face that showed concern and caution in equal measure. He did not remove the board. He did not endorse it aloud. That silence carried through town like a bell rung once and left to fade. Mockery hardened because Beckett made it economical. Men with seed debt repeated his words, and women dependent on his ledger. Credit repeated them at wells and wash lines, not always from malice, but from the practical fear of standing apart from the man who held their account books. By the second week of November, children had turned Fisher Folly into a sing-song phrase they shouted from the opposite side of the street, and one boy pinned a crude drawing of a henhouse to Kane's fence post with a bent nail. She removed it, split kindling, and returned to work without remark. In the evening, while feeding Juniper in the lean-to, she spoke the only complaint anyone heard from her that month. Let them talk. Their words cannot hold heat. Her project expanded from one durable house to a repeatable system she could teach if the town ever asked. She lifted her own floor again from beneath by adding a second layer of joists and establishing a precise 6-inch dead air channel between lower planks and upper finish boards, sealing all perimeter seams with wool waste dipped in lime slurry. She built 3 sleeping pallets from fence rails and crate slats, each platform 20 inches above floor level and 6 feet long, then numbered them in charcoal for assignment by age and infirmity should crowding come. She tested the clay-lined stove bench with measured burns, recording interior wall warmth every 2 hours through 1 full night and 1 full day. At 11 in the evening, with outside air at 14 degrees, the bench face held at 78. At 4 in the morning, after coals had dimmed, it still held 52. That was enough to keep blankets dry and hands serviceable. Materials remained scarce, so she bartered methodically. 1 quart of pickled turnip earned 4 pounds of lime from a mason whose shed roof had failed. 2 jars of beans bought 60 feet of hemp rope from a freighter stranded on the South Road. She paid cash, $12.30 over 3 weeks, for nails, hinges, and 1 small hand auger after selling a spare iron kettle at auction behind the feed store. By ledger, the expanded winter system cost $37.80, including original framing and later modifications. She tracked each line in the notebook, because Elias had written that memory was generous to pride and cruel to truth. By early December, she had stretched rope lines at shoulder height from her front step to the well, from the well to the church gate, and from the church gate to the back lane behind Beckett's store, where drift patterns usually ran shallower than the open street. She tied knots 1 forearm apart for counting distance by touch when visibility failed, and she anchored each span with doubled hitches around buried posts set 3 feet deep. She demonstrated the route once to Pastor Dent and once to widow Ellen Quinn, whose knees had worsened since autumn. Town leadership met afterward in the church anteroom and decided against public adoption, stating that visible rope networks would invite panic and suggest weakness to passing traders. Kane received that verdict from Dent at dusk and replied only that rope did not care for dignity. On December 12th, Beckett denied her winter credit in front of 12 customers, as he had promised he might, and he did it with deliberate theater. He placed her request slip on the counter, read her name aloud, and then set the slip beneath his closed ledger without entering a mark. "You may return by Christmas," he said. "When your little architecture fails, I will still have terms." Laughter moved through the room in cautious bursts, each soul gauging Beckett before joining. Kane gathered her empty sack and left without answer, then walked 2 blocks to the blacksmith yard and traded smoked pork for discarded barrel hoops she later cut into door braces. The weather gave one brief rehearsal on December 19th. A fast storm drove in from the north before dawn, buried door sills by noon, and trapped 2 families in front rooms for 13 hours when drift pressure jammed their entries shut. It passed before midnight, leaving broken fence rails, 1 collapsed chicken shed, and a lesson only a few were ready to hear. Kane's raised floor stayed dry. Her thresholds held. Heat remained where feet rested, At dusk, 3 mothers arrived separately, each with a child whose hands had gone raw from cold chores, and asked if the children might warm near her stove for 1 hour while supper fires were coaxed back to life at home. Cain admitted them in rotation, set warmed bricks at their boots, and sent each child home with a strip of wool and instructions to pack it into window seams. The first direct plea came the following evening, when 10-year-old Abel Quinn stood at her door with cap in both hands and spoke with the plain urgency of someone too young for pride and old enough for fear. Grandmother says her feet feel like boards after dark. She cannot sleep for it. Can you come? Cain took her coat, her measuring cord, and a sack of wool scrap. At the Quinn house, she found the bed frame low, floorboards gapped, and wind running unchecked beneath the sill. She raised the sleeping surface 8 inches using split rails and 2 stone blocks, stuffed the threshold, set a heated brick wrapped in cloth at the footboard, and showed Abel how to hang a blanket as an interior curtain to cut nighttime draft. She marked the Quinn doorframe with a white chalk arrow pointing toward the nearest rope line and drew a second mark at the church gate to indicate that their household included 1 elder with limited walking speed. Then she moved to the next house and repeated the process. By the week before Christmas, her work had changed in scope and purpose. She opened stores she had measured for 1 and rationed them for many. She taught 3 mothers in 1 afternoon to build elevated pallets from salvaged rails and cratewood, insisting on exact height and dry bedding rather than hurried imitation. She left chalk arrows at every doorway she modified, each mark indicating route priority and number of vulnerable sleepers inside. No proclamation accompanied this labor. No argument announced it. The town that had called her method folly began, house by house and under gathering cold, to live by it. Cain began the next morning before first light, adding structure to what had been emergency labor. She split a fresh board from a wagon sidewall and hung it beside her shelf of jars, then ruled it in charcoal columns: household name, sleepers, floor height, draft points, fuel days, route mark, last visit. Cedar Bluff held 346 souls by the church register, and she meant to know where the most vulnerable lay when weather closed sight and sound alike. Abel Quinn carried messages for her between noon chores and dusk, and Pastor Dent, after 2 days of watching mothers arrive and leave her door, gave her the church vestibule table each afternoon for instruction. The work itself expanded with a craftsman's precision and a field surgeon's urgency. She taught adults to build sleeping pallets at 20 inches minimum from floorboard, not for comfort, but for survival, because cold pooled low and stole heat first from feet and then from breath. She cut demonstration legs to exact lengths and marked each with a knife notch, so even hurried hands could match them in dim light. For homes without spare lumber, she used fence rails laid over pared stones, then cross-lashed with hemp to stop sway. She required dry fill beneath every mattress, straw fluffed and turned daily, never packed flat, never left damp from tracked snow. She reworked her own underfloor system again, not because it failed, but because she expected harder strain. On December 23rd, she crawled beneath the house with a tallow lamp and added 2 wind baffles at the north side, where open ground funneled gusts between the piers. Ash alone had held through early cold, but she mixed this layer with clay and chopped straw, kneading it with gloved hands until it formed dense cakes she could press into gaps around stone. She reset 3 loose boards above the dead air channel and ran a narrow bead of lime slurry along every seam. At dusk, she checked both thermometers. The crawl space remained within 2 degrees of 55. By Christmas week, the church outbuilding had become a workshop in all but name. Cain set 1 corner for wool sorting, 1 for rope splicing, 1 for salvaged lumber measured and stacked by length. She priced nothing for herself. Those who could trade brought beans, soap, lamp wicks, or labor hours, those who could not paid in attendance and discipline. Widow Quinn sat at the table and twisted wool strips for draft plugs, while two ranch boys planed rough slats into straight runners. Kane moved among them, correcting angles, adjusting brace points, insisting that a weak joint in fair weather became a broken bed frame in storm. Her voice remained even. Her standards did not bend. On December the 26th, she and Pastor Dent walked the lane behind Beckett's store and set 2 additional rope anchors where drift patterns had shifted since the 19th storm. She drove the posts 36 inches into frozen ground with a maul borrowed from the blacksmith, then wrapped each base in wet rawhide that would shrink tight as it dried. Knots went in every forearm span, exactly as before, but she added 3 double knots at turns to mark direction by feel in total whiteout. Dent watched her hands move and said, "I once thought this labor too severe for one young soul." Kane tied off the line, tested the tension, and answered, "Severe weather does not lower itself to meet gentle preparations." As her system grew, dismissal changed shape rather than disappearing. Open laughter thinned around homes where elders now slept warmer, yet social punishment hardened in other corners where pride still dictated judgment. Beckett began calling her chalk marks a nuisance that frightened customers and made Cedar Bluff appear weak to traders. He told a group of teamsters on his porch that a town governed by a child's arrows would soon beg for federal relief, and men who owed him on springseed notes laughed because their accounts depended on it. 2 women who had taken her wool strips in private crossed the street rather than greet her at noon. Children still sang Fisher Folly when adults listened. The exclusion reached formal channels in the final week of December. At a brief town meeting in the church hall, Councilman Ira Bell proposed that unauthorized route markings be removed from public doors and fence posts, citing order and appearance. He wore a new shearling collar and spoke as if weather obeyed tidy records. Kane stood at the back beside the stove and did not interrupt him. When he finished, Pastor Dent asked whether the council had an alternate cold route plan with measured distances and anchor points. Bell said he expected the roads to remain passable if citizens maintained composure. No vote removed her marks, yet no vote endorsed them either, and the ambiguity gave mockery fresh cover. Beckett used that cover with practiced skill. He set a chalk slate near his counter, listing coal oil and flour in careful hand, revising figures upward whenever shipment rumors worsened, then telling each buyer that speculative fear had forced his generosity to limits. He still refused Kane credit, and refused also the sale of 2 cracked barrels she requested for pallet wood, saying inventory could not be spared for experiments. In front of 6 customers, he added, "You may preach elevations and knots, but winter in this country answers men with capital, not children with notebooks." Kane listened, paid cash for 3 pounds of coarse salt at 50 cents the pound, and left with her sack folded flat under her arm. By December 29th, small acts of organized cruelty appeared where direct argument had failed. Someone cut 2 of her church-to-well rope lines in the night, clean slices made by a sharp blade near knee-height. Someone else smeared mud over 3 chalk arrows on Elder Pike's Row and scratched Fisher Folly across the church notice board. Kane rose before sunrise, replaced the lines with doubled hemp, retied every knot, and sealed each cut end with wax so fraying would show quickly if tampered with again. Abel Quinn asked who had done it. She handed him the new knot count list and said only, "Count by touch, not by rumor." Her persistence drew quiet allies from households previously silent. Blacksmith Jonah Creel donated a keg of bent nails and taught 2 boys to straighten them over a small anvil by candlelight. Ellen Quinn offered her parlor for women too far from the church workshop, and within 3 evenings they had assembled 7 additional pallets for homes along Creek Lane. Deputy Noah Pike, who had once called rope routes unnecessary, began checking her anchor posts at dusk while making rounds. None of these souls made speeches. They carried wood, held lanterns, and learned measurements with the humility that follows first discomfort but precedes full conviction. The warning signs deepened as the year turned. On January 1st, 1889, the morning sky over Cedar Bluff showed a broad, pale ring around the sun before noon, and by late afternoon, fine ice needles drifted from a cloudless blue. Stock animals changed first. Horses in the South Corral stood with backs to the northwest and refused open water until trough edges were broken twice. Chickens crowded tight under coop boards before sunset. Dogs dug under porches and would not be called out. Kane walked the East Ridge with Juniper and saw rabbit tracks running in erratic loops as if scent and direction had both failed. She wrote each sign in her notebook margin beside the date. 2 days later, she took a hand barometer from Pastor Dent's shelf, compared it with his ledger note from the previous week, and found a sharp pressure drop that did not match visible cloud build. She returned the instrument, then moved through 12 houses before dark, checking door sweeps and teaching one new habit at each stop. Hang wet mittens from ceiling lines, never near floor. Warm bricks before bed, and wrap them dry. Keep one pail of water indoors at all times because pumps freeze first when wind rises. At the Hale house, she found the youngest children sleeping on quilts laid directly on boards. She raised them that evening with crates and 2 split rails, then marked the doorway with a double arrow for early assistance. The town still searched for reasons to discount what stood plainly before it. Councilman Bell told a group outside the post shed that animal behavior varied too widely to serve as evidence. Beckett announced that January cold had always inspired exaggeration among those who profited from alarm, and pointed to his stacked shelves as proof of stability. Men at the hitching rail nodded because flour sacks remained visible, and because admitting vulnerability cost social standing in a settlement so new that reputation still served as currency. Kane heard them as she carried rope coils past the mercantile and did not slow her pace. On January 4th, the air turned brittle in a way old farmers recognized, and the untrained often misread as mere clarity. Every sound traveled too far. Axe blows from the mill lot rang across 3 streets. Harness buckles snapped like twigs. Smoke from chimneys rose straight for 10 feet, then flattened hard to the southeast, driven by a high current no one felt at ground level. Kane took that evening to inspect the entire rope network, end to end, gloves off at each knot to verify texture and thickness, and she replaced 4 worn spans with fresh hemp, while Abel held lantern light steady despite the bite in the wind. By the next night, a deceptive stillness settled over Cedar Bluff, complete and polished as if the settlement had been fitted beneath glass. Supper fires burned clean, stars sharpened to needle points. A few households treated the calm as vindication and reopened windows to clear stove smoke, wasting heat they could not spare. Kane moved from door to door along Creek Lane and South Water, asking only whether floor pallets were set and fuel split in room for 2 days. Some thanked her without meeting her eyes. Some said they would manage. At Beckett's back entrance, she saw clerks carrying cases from his warehouse to the sales floor and heard him instruct them to hold kerosene for premium accounts first. 3 days passed between her first full route inspection and the sky's final change. On January the 7th, before sunrise, she stepped onto her raised porch and found the horizon erased not by darkness but by a low white wall advancing over the eastern flats with unnatural speed, lifting loose snow into spirals that reached above fence height and then above rooftops. Juniper stamped in the lean-to and pulled against her lead rope. Church bells rang once, then were swallowed by wind. Kane turned inside, took down the household board with its names and marks, and set the first shelter shift in motion while Cedar Bluff still believed it had one more ordinary morning. She sent Abel Quinn along the nearest rope line with 2 written notices wrapped in waxed cloth, one for Pastor Dent and one for Ellen Quinn, each stating the same order in block letters: elders first, then households with weak stoves, 1 blanket, and 1 cup per soul. No trunks. By 6 in the morning, the wind struck from the northwest with a force that bent smoke flat to the ground, and by 7, it drove loose snow in sheets so dense that the church steeple dissolved from sight, though it stood less than 300 yards away. Kane checked the wall thermometer at her door at first light and read -18. She checked again 2 hours later and read -27. The storm did not build in measured steps. It seized the town at once. Fences vanished under fast drifts, alleys became white trenches, and men who had crossed Water Street in clear dawn found themselves counting knots by gloved fingers before breakfast. Kane kept her door half-latched, admitting groups by list order and turning none away, and she assigned each newcomer a platform number on the wall with charcoal marks that could be read in dim light. Her raised floor and dead air channel performed as she had calculated. Boots came off above dry planks. Feet remained off freezing boards. The clay-lined stove bench held heat through lulls in the fire. Outside, the wind was not wind anymore. It was a tool of pressure and subtraction, stripping visibility, direction, and confidence in the same hour. By noon on January the 7th, Cedar Bluff had ceased functioning as a town and had become separated pockets of endurance. Beckett tried to keep his mercantile open by posting 1 clerk at the front and 1 at the rear warehouse, selling coal oil at 60 cents and flour by half sacks to those who could pay cash. He stood in his broadcloth coat for the first hour, then retreated inside when spindrift began coming through the door seams like ground glass. Kerosene in the front tins thickened and clouded by mid-afternoon. A roof seam over the back storeroom began to drip onto stacked flour, wetting the top sacks and then the ones beneath as men dragged tarpaulins into place too late. The slate board of prices remained near the counter, but the figures ceased to matter. Shelves that had signaled authority through November now showed gaps, then boards, then bare nails where scoops had hung. Pastor Dent reached Kane's house shortly after 1 in the afternoon, with frost on his beard and 2 deacons tied to him by rope. They brought 6 elders from Creek Lane in a staggered file, each soul linked at the wrist to the line, each instructed to keep 1 hand on the shoulder ahead and 1 hand on the knots. Kane moved them directly to the east wall platforms where heat held longest. She had planned for 40 in 1 shift with narrow spacing. By dusk, she held 53. She set strict cycles, 20 minutes near stove, then rotate outward. Boots hung on overhead lines, not near floor. Broth by ladle at the half hour. No one asleep without dry socks. She made Beckett's old phrase meaningless by repetition of method. Fisher folly became triage. Night fell before 5. And by that hour the outside thermometer at Kane's porch read -34 with gusts that shook shutter hinges. Men attempted to secure outbuildings and returned disoriented, faces chalked with ice, admitting in hoarse voices that they had lost lane markers they had walked for years. Kane sent only trained pairs back out, each pair tied to a belay point at her door, each carrying a wrapped coal pan and 2 spare scarves. She refused solitary trips regardless of rank. Councilman Ira Bell argued once, saying he would not take orders from a child while his own barn stood at risk. Kane handed him a rope coil, gave him 2 knot checks to recite, and sent him with Deputy Noah Pike and Jonah Creel toward South Water. They returned with 1 trapped couple and 1 elderly ranch hand. The barn was lost by morning. The second day, January 8th, opened in darkness that looked like dusk at noon. Kane recorded -38 at dawn and Pastor Dent later copied the number into the church ledger because ink seemed to confer reality on suffering that speech could not hold. Drifts climbed past porch rails and pressed against doors with the steady shove of wet cement. Families who had dismissed her chalk arrows now felt for them with mittened hands and wept when fingers found the marks under rime. Martha Quinn, who had delivered half the babies in Cedar Bluff over 20 years and had never asked to be carried anywhere, insisted on leaving shelter at mid-morning when word came that Clara Finch had gone into labor in a back room near the mill lane. Kane objected and offered to send another woman, but Martha fixed her scarf, took one wool blanket and one spare coat, and said she had walked to harder rooms than this. She reached the Finch house by rope with Abel at her rear and brought the mother through the worst of labor by afternoon, while the storm beat the siding in long blows. Near evening, when Clara and her newborn son were stable enough to move, Martha wrapped the child first, then the mother, and gave her own heavy coat to Clara for the walk to church shelter. She took Abel's arm and began the return in only a wool shawl over her dress. 50 paces from the church gate, the line dipped beneath fresh drift, and in that confusion Abel lost her hand for one breath and found it again on the next knot. She did not speak after that. They reached the gate with Clara alive, and the infant breathing warm against his mother. Martha Quinn was carried the last 10 yards and did not recover warmth despite bricks, blankets, and 3 hours near Kane's stove. She died just before midnight with Pastor Dent reading from memory because the pages shook in his hands. By the third morning, January 9th, the storm had eaten through Cedar Bluff's ordinary hierarchies. Beckett's clerks abandoned the front room and moved what remained of dry goods upstairs to escape meltwater from roof leaks. 2 windows on the windward side cracked from pressure and cold stress, and the patched panes whistled all day despite canvas nailed over them. Beckett attempted one more sale period at premium rates and found only 3 buyers, all seeking matches and lamp wicks rather than flour. He lowered prices before noon, then bartered by candle after dusk, then closed entirely when the rear stair iced over, and one clerk slipped carrying a crate. The empty shelves stood in the lantern light like rib bones, a frame without flesh. Community suffering became less dramatic and more relentless, measured in coughing fits, numb hands that would not close around spoons, and the slow panic of households hearing woodpiles shorten while wind did not. Kane's ledger board filled with amended marks. Fuel 1 day, fuel half day. Elder delirious, stove cracked, root blocked. She moved in cycles, 2 hours in shelter management, 1 hour in field checks, always roped, always with a second walker. Deputy Noah Pike took the most dangerous lane because he knew every hitching post and drainage dip by memory and could orient others when snow erased lines. At dusk, he tied himself to a church anchor and led schoolteacher Lydia Ames, her sister, and a bundled child from their collapsed rear porch toward Kane's route. A crosswind tore the line from his left hand, near Beckett's hitching rail. Lydia reached the next knot. Pike did not. They found him at first light against a drifted hitching post, body locked around the child he had pulled inside his coat. The child was alive and breathing when they pried the coat open. He died where the line bent toward shelter. One line of time remained clear in all accounts. By midnight on January 9th, when the porch thermometer reached -42 and stayed there, no household in Cedar Bluff could survive alone without luck or prior preparation. Kane's house held 67 souls in staggered shifts, exactly as close as she had once feared, and then planned for, with sleeping platforms filled edge to edge and feet kept dry above planks warmed by retained stove heat. The church held another 42 under Dent's direction. Smaller clusters occupied reinforced rooms on Creek Lane. No one spoke of pride any longer. They spoke of rope distance, stove draw, and whether the next load of split pine would arrive before dawn. On January 10th, the fourth day, the storm finally slackened from a roar to a continuous hard hiss. Visibility returned in fragments. Roof lines reappeared first, then chimneys, then half-buried fences. In that partial calm, Kane and Ellen Quinn made rounds to households marked with double arrows. At the Hale house, they found Ruthie Hale, 7 years old, fever-hot and pulling for breath after 2 nights of cold exposure in rooms where the fire had failed. They moved her to Fisher Shelter, propped her upright on quilts, dosed willow bark and onion broth, and rotated warm cloths through the night while her cough deepened into lung fever. She asked for her rag doll and for her mother to keep stitching beside her so the room would sound normal. She died 2 days after the rescue, after roads reopened enough for horse travel, with Ellen holding one hand and Kane counting her breaths until there were no more to count. Help was sought in its plainest form on the third night, and it came from the man who had named Kane's work a joke. Harlan Beckett reached her door after dark on January 9th with his gloves stiff, his fingers blackened at the tips, and his coat front crusted white from driven snow that had melted and frozen twice. He stood without his silver chain, without porch voice, without ledger authority. 2 clerks waited behind him, one supporting the other by the elbow. Beckett removed his hat and said, "My back room has failed. I have 20 souls in and around the store. 6 are elderly. 2 cannot walk unaided. I ask instruction." Kane did not pause for accusation, and she did not offer mercy as theater. She handed Beckett a rope harness, tightened the knot at his shoulder, and assigned him to wood and water detail under Jonah Creel's supervision. She sent one clerk with Pastor Dent to clear a church aisle for overflow pallets, and sent the other with Abel to carry broth tins from her crawlspace stores. Then she walked Beckett through the route map by lantern, tapping each line with her finger. Store to church by rear lane, church to Fisher House by north rope. No one travels unbound. No one travels alone. No premium accounts, no withheld blankets, no argument at the threshold. He repeated each order back in a voice stripped to function. Before dawn, he had hauled 3 sled loads of split pine from a drifted sheed, carried water pails until his shoulders shook, and guided 12 souls along the very knot lines he had ridiculed in November. At first light, he returned for another run without being told. The town watched him pass, head down, hands wrapped in linen over damaged skin, and saw in that posture what the storm had already declared in harsher language. Credit, coatcloth, and public certainty had failed. Preparation, measurement, and shared labor had held. Kane kept the door open, kept the stove fed, and kept assigning work until rescue became routine, and routine became survival. Through January 10th and into January 11th, while the wind still dragged snow across Cedar Bluff in long white sheets, she broke her stores into measured lots and recorded each lot in Elias Fisher's notebook. 3 pounds dried turnip to the church kitchen, 2 quarts beans to Ellen Quinn for elder broth, 1 smoked ham cut into 32 portions for mixed shelter shifts, lamp oil by spoon count rather than by cup. She refused chaos because panic wasted more than hunger did. Souls entered her house with numb hands and left with tasks, and those tasks made the difference between waiting and enduring. Beckett hauled split pine beside ranch boys who had once repeated his porch jokes. Councilman Ira Bell carried ash buckets to keep door ice from sealing shut. No one argued with her spacing marks on the wall anymore. By dawn on January 12th, the storm had weakened enough for controlled movement beyond rope lines, and Kane began converting emergency shelter into a teaching floor, while the crisis still held teeth. She set 1 demonstration pallet near the stove and made every able adult build it once. Rails, cross slats, 20-inch lift, dry straw, wool plug at floor seam, Blanket curtain 3 hand widths from the sleeper's face so breath could warm its own pocket of air. She made them repeat knotwork with gloves on and eyes closed. She sent each household runner home with 2 items only, never 3. So load stayed manageable in drifts. 1 heat brick wrapped in cloth, 1 sack of straw, or 1 bundle of wool strips. Her method looked modest beside the mercantile's former abundance, but modest preparations held where expensive stock had spoiled under leaking roof seams and frozen tins. Pastor Dent, who had once hesitated to speak over her notice board, stood at her side and read names from the shelter roster while she matched fuel and food to need. 17 households received dry ration bags from her crawlspace before noon that day, and every bag bore a chalk note: raise sleepers tonight, seal 1 draft before sleep, report by bell. Abel Quinn and 2 older girls copied those instructions to scrap paper so no family could claim uncertainty. Near dusk, Beckett returned from his store with a list of what remained usable in his inventory, and for the first time, he submitted it to someone else's plan. Kane circled items with a carpenter's pencil and assigned them without regard to debt ledgers. 20 pounds flour to the church, kerosene remnants to homes with infants, salt to Dent for communal curing once roads reopened. Beckett nodded and carried the sacks where she pointed. The roads broke open in stages, not with relief, but with labor. On January 14th, 6 men and 3 women cut a trench down Water Street shoulder to shoulder, measuring progress by fence posts uncovered. On January 15th, a telegraph rider reached the line south of town and sent Cedar Bluff's request for flour, lamp oil, and coal to Cheyenne, with Dent's signature and Beckett's warehouse tally attached. The reply arrived the next evening. First wagon could come in 4 days if weather held and drifts were cleared at the creek bend. Kane noted the date, then turned to the immediate work, because 4 days remained a long distance in deep cold. She shifted 67 shelter souls back to their homes in ranked order, elders first and children with cough second, and each departing household carried a chalked checklist nailed to the doorframe. Floor height verified, rope path marked, 2-day fuel in room, water pail indoors, bedding dry. When the first blue sky appeared full and steady on January 16th, the dead were prepared. Martha Quinn was laid out in the church anteroom, with her hands folded around the wool shawl she had worn on her final walk, and Clara Finch placed the newborn son she had saved in Ellen Quinn's arms while prayers were spoken. Deputy Noah Pike was buried 2 days later near the hitching rail he had used as his last marker, and the child he had wrapped in his coat stood between Lydia Ames and Pastor Dent, too young to understand duty, yet old enough to remember the shape of the coat. Ruthie Hale's small coffin was carried by her uncles at sunset, with her rag doll tucked at the blanket edge, because her mother said the child had asked for familiar sounds and familiar touch. Cedar Bluff had argued all winter about dignity and rank. At those graves, argument ended. 3 days passed before the church gathering that settled what mockery had done and what survival required next. Every bench was full on January 19th, coats drying by the stove, boots lined against the wall. The count near 300 souls, because even those still angry came to hear whether blame would be demanded. Beckett stood first, broadcloth replaced by a plain wool coat borrowed from his own stock, hands bandaged where frostbite had taken skin. He did not shorten his words. He repeated the phrase Fisher Folly aloud, then repeated the sentence about a chicken coop, then the threat that she would beg by Christmas. He said each line in the same order he had once used for laughter, and then he said he had nearly buried Cedar Bluff with that pride. He confessed the oil prices he raised from 22 cents to 45, then to 60 in storm hours, and he named the shelves that had failed him. Flour wet from roof leak, kerosene gelled, ledger credit meaningless in whiteout. He signed in front of Dent and Bell and Kane a transfer of his rear warehouse to communal winter use for 5 years, rent $1 per year for legal form only, and he nailed a fresh slate beside the pulpit listing fixed emergency prices for the coming winter with no premium accounts. Councilman Bell rose next and admitted the council had chosen appearance over preparation when it refused public rope routes. Lydia Ames stood and said she had called Kane's arrows childish marks and had scrubbed one from her own lintel in December, then nearly lost her sister finding shelter in January dark. 2 ranch hands who had sung Fisher Folly in the lane repeated their own words without excuse and asked to be assigned to spring rebuilding crews. One by one, not with tears for display but with exhausted accuracy, souls in that church spoke the distance between contempt and dependence. Some apologized directly. Some only said, "I was wrong." A few said nothing and stared at their hands, but they did not leave. Kane listened through all of it without lowering her gaze and without stepping into the role they were ready to hand her, because easy pardon would have cost the lesson its weight. When Dent finally asked whether she would speak, she stood beside the stove bench she had taught from for weeks and answered in a voice that carried to the door. She said her mother taught that forgiveness without changed practice was weather talk, warm for an hour and gone by dusk. She said 3 named graves stood on the hill and required more than sentiment. She said she would not keep score, and she would not pretend wounds had not been made. Then she offered terms greater than pardon. Every Saturday through thaw and into next winter, she would teach preservation, floor elevation, rope planning, and fuel accounting to any household willing to bring tools and follow measurements exactly. She said, "I did not build to prove one soul smaller than another. I built because cold reaches all houses alike. If you wish this town to live, learn the work." No cheer followed. The silence that came was heavier and better than cheer. It was agreement. By March 1889, the rear warehouse behind Beckett's store had been swept, lime-washed, and fitted with long shelving built from salvaged crate planks under Kane's instruction. Dent kept the communal ledger there, open each Wednesday, listing jars, grain sacks, smoke-cured meat, lamp oil, wool scrap, and cordwood contributions by household and by date. Beckett honored the posted emergency prices through the next season without exception, and when supply wagons arrived late in November, he sold first to homes with infants and elders, recording each sale in public view. He did not ask Kane for absolution again. He carried barrels where she told him and learned to set pallet legs square. By the second week of October 1890, rope lines linked every block of Cedar Bluff from Church Gate to South Corrals, with direction knots standardized and tested by schoolchildren each first Monday. 26 houses stood on stone piers at least 3 feet above grade. 12 more had raised sleeping platforms, though their floors remained low. The phrase Fisher Folly disappeared from taunts and returned in instruction. Fisher high floors, Fisher knots, Fisher checks before storm. Abel Quinn, taller now and solemn in his work, taught new arrivals how to count distance by touch. Ellen Quinn supervised wool storage and winter brick warming. Lydia Ames added cold root drills to school lessons between copybook hours. Years moved, and the town changed shape as frontier towns do, with births and departures and hard seasons that did not become legend because they were met in time. Kane remained at the East Edge lot, repairing, teaching, recording. She bought 2 adjacent strips of land when she could, and planted windbreak willow where open gusts had once run unchecked. In 1891, she and a crew of volunteers raised a second training house beside the first, built to demonstration cutaway, so any learner could see the dead air channel, ash baffles, and threshold plugs in plain cross-section. Travelers from Granite Falls and Dusty Fork, came to observe and carried the methods home in notebooks of their own. Decades later, the first raised house still stands at Cedar Bluff's edge. Weathered boards silvered by winter light, stone piers firm in ground that once mocked their height. The warehouse ledger remains preserved in church keeping, with entries in Dent's hand, Beckett's hand, and the careful script Cain learned from Elias. Children trace the carved words above the training door before first snow each year. Build it Fisher high, and winter will pass under your feet. Children trace the carved words with mittened forefingers, reading each letter aloud as Cain stands beside the door and checks their knot cords for even spacing. The first snow of October 1892 has begun as fine grain, almost shy. Yet every child in Cedar Bluff knows the rule that follows the first visible flurry. Report to the training house by dusk. Bring one blanket, one cup, one length of rope. Beckett arrives last, carrying a crate of slate pencils and a rolled price board under one arm. He sets both on the bench and waits until Cain nods before he speaks. The board is written for this season, he says. Coal oil returns to 24 cents per gallon at ordinary sale. Emergency ceiling remains fixed at 30. Flour and salt are listed the same way. Ledger, open to any eye. Cain reads the figures, then passes the board to Pastor Dent, who hangs it on 2 iron pegs inside the training wall, where every household can see it before service each Sunday. No one claps. They begin work. That evening, under lamplight, Cain opens the communal inventory chest and accounts for every category she once guarded alone. Jars are counted by row and date. Smoked meat is weighed on a hanging scale and entered by ounce. Wool strips are bundled in 20s and tied with blue twine for elder homes. The old crawlspace thermometers, the same 2 she bought at 35 cents each, are set on the table as teaching instruments. She places one above the floor and one at ankle height, then has the youngest students read both numbers. The difference is 7 degrees. The lesson needs no ornament. By the second week of November, she has resumed house rounds with Abel Quinn, now tall enough to carry a full tool satchel without dragging it through snow. At the Hale door, Ruthie's mother meets them with a sealed tin of dried apples and places it in Cain's hands without a word. At Lydia Ames's schoolroom, children practice root counts with closed eyes, palms moving knot to knot across a line strung between desk posts. At Beckett's warehouse, now Preservation Hall, 3 shelves are marked in black paint: Public Reserve, Infant Allotment, Elder Allotment. The merchant keeps his own office smaller than before, and his public ledger larger. On November 19th, after evening prayers, Councilman Ira Bell asks Pastor Dent for the floor and does not wait for invitation before stepping into the aisle. His collar is plain, his voice rough from cold and from what he has carried too long. I have one unfinished matter, he says, looking not at Dent but at Cain. On December 29th, the year of the great storm, I told my nephew and his friend to cut 2 rope lines near the church well. I said those lines made the town appear afraid. I called it a correction for order. Cain replaced them before dawn, and I let others suspect vagrants. I have never spoken this aloud. The room holds still. Bell continues with visible effort. I do not ask to be excused. Deputy Pike died on a route I sought to weaken. If Cain had not doubled those lines, more would have been lost. I place this in the record so that my grandchildren may hear it from my own mouth and not from rumor. Dent writes the confession into the church ledger in full, then turns to Cain. She does not answer quickly. When she does, her voice remains measured. You will not be excluded from work, she says. You will inspect church-to-well anchors each storm warning for the next 3 winters, with 2 witnesses each time. You will teach the reason for double lines to every new family. That is the correction that serves the dead. Bell bows his head once. I accept. 3 days later, one of Beckett's former clerks, Milton Voss, asks to speak while volunteers stack cordwood in the preservation hall. Snow taps the window boards in a steady rhythm as he stands by the weighing table, hat in both hands. I laughed when Beckett laughed, Milton says. I copied his prices and watched mothers choose between oil and flour, while I told myself I was only writing numbers. I cannot return what was taken in those hours. Kane keeps sorting wool as she answers. Then stop describing yourself as a pen without a hand. You have a hand. Use it. He asks where. She points to the south wall where new shelves still need bracing. He works there until midnight, then returns every Thursday through freeze-up without being asked again. By January 1893, Cedar Bluff tests its system in weather not as brutal as the blizzard of 1889, yet severe enough to expose pretense. A 2-day whiteout drops temperatures to -29 and erases the road markers between Church and Creek Lane. No household is isolated. Rope lines hold. Elevated pallets keep bedding dry. Public reserves open by roster, then close by measured allotment. When the storm breaks, Dent reads the tally from the pulpit. No starvation, no freezing deaths. 2 cases of lung fever treated and recovered. 1 barn collapse with livestock loss only. The town hears those numbers as a form of prayer. Late that winter, Beckett visits Kane at her east lot after dusk, when the stove bench has gone from hot to warm and the room smells of pine pitch and onion broth. He removes his gloves carefully, fingers still misshapen from the storm years earlier. I have carried one question and delayed it for pride, he says. Do you forgive me? Kane sets her pencil down beside Elias Fisher's notebook. Forgiveness is not a receipt I issue, she says. You changed prices. You opened your ledger. You carried wood when command had left you. You continue the work. Keep doing it. That is the only language Winter believes. Beckett nods, and the nod contains relief without triumph. He leaves a sack of lamp wicks at her door and walks back along the knot line without lantern. On March 2nd, 1895, a letter arrives by rider from the state office in Cheyenne, replying to Dent's earlier supply report and requesting Cedar Bluff's methods for circulation to 3 smaller settlements west of Elk Mountain. Kane does not send speeches. She sends measurements, pier height, dead air gap depth, knot spacing, emergency price board format, shelter rotation intervals, elder marking symbols, inventory columns by household. She includes 1 line at the bottom in her mother's hand, copied exactly. Keep the wind moving where you choose. By autumn 1898, the churchyard holds a demonstration day each year before first frost. Families from Granite Falls and Dusty Fork attend with notebooks and questions. Abel Quinn, now a grown man with a carpenter's square hanging from his belt, teaches underfloor baffle packing to a circle of boys who once would have called such labor strange. Lydia Ames has her students recite warning signs in order: early geese, high beaver dams, halo ring, ice needles, smoke flattening to the southeast. They do not recite them as superstition. They recite them as data. Pastor Dent dies in 1901 at 71, and at his burial, Bell reads from the ledger pages, Dent kept through the blizzard winter, including Beckett's confession and his own. The entries remain unedited. Shame is preserved beside repair, as it should be. Beckett dies in 1906 after a short illness, leaving the rear warehouse deeded outright to the church trust instead of held by yearly transfer. In his final written instruction, copied by Milton and witnessed by Kane, he requires that emergency price boards remain public and fixed each year before November 1st. He leaves his silver watch chain to the Preservation Hall wall, not as honor, but as reminder of what Polish could not buy. The first raised house still stands at the east edge of Cedar Bluff, In winter, snow drifts beneath it and does not claim the floor. In spring, children crawl under the joists to feel the packed ash baffles and learn why still air can be built like a wall. Kane Fisher grows older there, then slower. Then one winter stops teaching with a hammer and teaches from the bench while others cut and fit to her numbers. When she dies, the town buries her on the church slope near Elias in May, and the procession follows rope lines though the sky is clear. Cedar Bluff keeps the notebook in a locked case and the methods in open use, which is the only custody that matters. Each first snow, children still trace the carving above the training door before they tie their practice knots. They read it aloud in steady voices while elders check stores by lantern and younger hands raise pallets before supper. Build it Fisher high, and winter will pass under your feet.